Hey guys, so yesterday I had my speaking exam, so instead of doing our part two of our reading test, I want to instead give some tips and a run through about how you can do your Chinese oral. So, yeah, let's get started. So, you guys may be wondering why I'm on a different channel. Well, it's because I forgot the email to my original YouTube channel. And since I didn't have like a recovery thing, I just had to start over again. So getting that out of the way, and also if you haven't seen my first video, I've re-uploaded it on this new channel, so you can check that out if you want. Anyway, so moving on to the actual speaking oral itself, the structure of it's split up into three parts in this new course. So you have part one, which is describing a photo, and then part two, which is answering questions about that photo's theme, and the third part is discussing the other themes in the course. So, for example, if your photo was on traditional Chinese festivals, that would come under the theme of experiences, Tiyan. So, in part two, you would talk about Tiyan, and then part three, you would talk about the other themes such as 社会组织 or 共享地球. And the time allocated to these parts, it's 3 to 4 minutes for the first part, 5 to 6 minutes for the second part, and 4 to 5 for the third part. Alright, tip number one, describing the photo well. So right off the bat, when you start to speak, the first sentence you should say is 这张图片的主题是, and then whatever the main theme is, and then 是关于, and then what the specific topic is, 的话题. So for example, if my photo was on, again, traditional Chinese festivals, I'd say 这张图片的主题是体验 experiences, 是关于传统的节日的话题. So yeah, and then when you're describing the photo, there's the first part is split into three mini parts. So describing what's in the picture, then describing what the picture is like communicating, and then relating that message of the picture to Chinese culture. And when you're doing the first two parts, describing the picture and describing the events happening in the picture, your level of description needs to be pretty thorough. So I've listed a bunch of examples like talking about age, season, clothing, hair, position of the people, etc. The reason you should be very thorough is that you can chew up quite a lot of time, like 1 to 2 minutes, and you flesh out enough detail for the examiners to be pleased. And then tip number two is your 10 dot points. So when you get a picture, you're usually given like 10 to 15 minutes to look at it, write down a couple quick notes, and these quick notes are comprised of only 10 short dot points. So what do you want to have for your 10 dot points? Well, instead of like aspects of the picture, like oh, there is a boy in this picture, those you shouldn't put down as your dot points because they sort of waste space, and if your dot points are describing anything in the picture itself, you can always just look at the picture to remind you that, oh, that thing's in there. So rather, your 10 dot points should be about your arguments like how the photo supports Chinese culture, or even putting down stuff for parts 2 and 3. So the discussion with your examiner about the other themes or the theme in question in the photo. Tip number three is when you're describing the events, it's different from describing like what's in the picture, as you instead describe or infer what event is happening. So for example, the practice picture we're going to be doing in this video, it's about education, and it involves like a child and his parent. Now the event you're describing should be, for example, the parent is angry at the kid because he didn't get a good grade, and then you like support that event using this evidence from the picture. And then when doing this, sometimes students make the mistake of like trying to give personal opinion about what's happening. So, for example, 我觉得 or 在我的看法. This is good. However, you want to save that for part two, as your examiner will often ask you questions on that note, like 你觉得 or 在你的看法. So don't do that for part one of when you're discussing the photo. Rather do that for part two when you're talking with your examiner. Tip number 4. When you're relating it back to Chinese culture, this requires like you to like know a bit about Chinese culture as in relation to like what the theme and topic is about. So for example, if you're talking about education as your topic, 社会组织, you would want to talk about how the Chinese really place a lot of importance on education, and how, for example, Chinese have the Gaokao, which is a very competitive tertiary entrance exam, and how students face a lot of stress and pressure trying to revise and study. You would talk about those. And then when you talk about Chinese culture, a good thing to do is to use a lot of idioms or chengyu. This helps draw closer to like Chinese culture, and you can score marks for language use and flair. So for example, education, which is my example, I use several idioms. If you want to see those idioms and like how you can more and examples about how you can relate back to Chinese culture, I'm posting a couple of videos describing like each theme and topic, and then how Chinese culture supports those topics. So I'll be posting them later, so be on the lookout for them. So here I have an example picture, and first we start off with 这个图片的主题是社会组织是关于教育的话题. So immediately I've said the main theme and the topic. So social relationships and education. Now when you're describing the photo, comment about literally everything. So this can range from commenting about how there's two children, they're wearing school uniforms, one carries a red school bag, one carries a green school bag, one got 100% in an exam while the other kid only got 53. You can talk about the color of their hair, hat, and also like what's on their face. So for example, 女孩面上有一个吻的印象. So on the girl's face there is an impression of a kiss, and 在男孩面上有一个手的印象. There's an impression of a hand on this boy's face. 所以男孩大概被父母打. So he was probably hit by his parents for the low grade. So basically, those would be describing the various aspects of the photo as well as the event. And then when you're relating it back to Chinese culture, you would say 中国人非常重视教育, and then you'd say they value education importantly, and then you discuss like, well, why did they do that? Well, China has a lot of people. It's very competitive. 如果你要上好大学，你的成绩就最好的. So if you want to get into a good university, your grades need to be the best. And then you can also talk about the stress Chinese students face when revising so much. And you could also talk about, if the photo has, for example, a teacher, you could talk about how Chinese students respect teachers and how their relationship is. A famous idiom by Confucius was 一日为师，终生为父, which means a teacher for a day is like a father for a lifetime. So sort of stress that importance of education in China, and that would be your Chinese culture. Now, tip 5, for part 2 and 3, the questions will be asked by either your teacher or your examiner. And common things they ask you are your opinion, so 在你的看法 or 你觉得, and then comparing cultures, so 在你的国家 or 中国文化比你的文化有什么区别, like differences, and then possible solutions. So they might ask, 我们如何应对这个问题? So like how do we face this problem? And the third one's pretty common in like 环保 when you face like environmental problems, or 社会组织 when you have to face social problems like discrimination or the gap between rich and poor and that kind of stuff. And then tip 6, this is a small one, but try to control your speed at which you speak, because if you speak too fast, you go too fast and you won't fulfill like the timing criteria, which is like 15 minutes total. However, if you speak too slow, you can't get your main points across, and by the time 15 minutes is up, you wouldn't have said enough to impress your examiners or teachers. Excuse me. And then tip number 7 is brush up on your key points for each theme. Now, not only is this important for part 2, but also especially for part 3, as the examiners can often quickly switch back and forth between themes. So in my case, my teacher first asked me about Australian bushfires and CO2 emissions, and she went to racial discrimination, and then back to environmental protection, but this time for saving energy and recycling. But because she like flicked back and forth really fast, and that I wasn't familiar with the Huanbao Environmental Protection Unit very well, I failed to like answer some of the questions, which lost me marks in both my message and communication skills criteria. So if you have your key points sort of memorized in your head beforehand, you'll be able to give an answer quickly and concisely, and you can keep going more fluidly than I. And of course, get those good marks. And tip number 8, which is, of course, the final tip, and it's quite a common one across many orals, is to keep calm, because nervousness can screw you over. And if you have some sort of plan, and plus you have your 10 dot points and your picture as well, by having some plan about how you're going to speak and what you're going to speak about, the oral won't feel like it's immediately on the spot and like testing you out of the blue. And by following your plan that you have created, which will feel nice and familiar to you, you can get through this fairly confidently with relative ease. And having that confidence will allow you to speak more eloquently and fluently, and that will get you a high mark, especially in the communication criteria, when the teacher assesses on how much you are willing to communicate fluently and with confidence. So yeah, and that's it. That's the oral basically. So yeah, and as I said before, if you want like more specific details on Chinese culture or more examples on describing a photo, just put it down in the YouTube comments or Reddit comments, and I will try and make a video for you guys. And catch you later, guys. See ya.